What's up, everyone? Welcome back to the Budget Sportsman. Thank you so much for joining me on today's video. This is going to be the final video in my three-part series on how to film your own hunt. If you haven't seen the first two videos, I would encourage you to go back and watch them. There'll be a link down in the description, or you can go to my channel. You'll see three different videos, all with this same thumbnail, but you'll see a 1, 2, or 3 up in the corner. The first video, I talked all about my own equipment, what cameras I use, what camera arm I use, how I mount everything in the tree, and get everything all set to go. The second video, I talked about how to choose cameras, whether you should choose a camera like this, a DSLR, whether you should choose a camcorder, whether you should choose a GoPro. There's a lot of information there about how to choose what camera might be right for you. In today's video, I want to talk some about camera settings and how to set up your camera to get the best video. One of the questions I see a lot from hunters who are getting ready to start filming their hunts is, what camera settings should I use? Well, one thing that you'll find is that if you really truly understand your camera settings and how they work together, they really apply the same whether it's a hunting video or whether it is a wedding video. You just have to understand how the settings all work and how they work together. What I really want to focus on today is the three primary settings that affect your exposure. What is exposure? Well, it's really the brightness of the image. What we're looking for is a nice, even image where you can see everything in the image and all the detail. You don't want something that's blown out. Blown out simply means that it's too bright and part of the image has turned completely to white. You don't also want an image that's too dark, that has turned completely to black and you've lost all detail in that dark section. So you want a nice, even exposure. Most cameras will have an automatic exposure setting, or they'll even have a little graph that will tell you when it feels like it's a proper exposure. Now, there are three main settings that control the exposure of your image or your video. They would be ISO, aperture, and shutter speed. Let's start with shutter speed first. Now, shutter speed in photography plays a little bit of a different role and a larger role than it does in video. So let me address that first, and then I'll talk how it plays a role in video. In photography, if you have a very long shutter speed, like 1 whole second, that's going to allow a lot of light to come in because the shutter is open for that entire time. The other thing that it does, however, is it would also allow any motion happening during that 1 second to become blur in the image. Now let's go to the other far extreme of 1/1000th of a second. Because that shutter speed is so fast and the shutter is open for such a very short amount of time, it would allow a very small amount of light into your camera. On the other hand, unless you have something in your frame that is moving incredibly fast, a high shutter speed like 1/1000th of a second, or a very fast shutter speed I should say, would freeze any motion in the frame. Now, how does that apply to video? Well, unfortunately, in video, we don't have the latitude to make those huge adjustments from all the way from 1 or even multiple seconds all the way down to 1/2000th or 1/4000th of a second. We simply don't have that ability. Here's one of the reasons why. If you're shooting your video in 30 frames per second, basically the easiest way I can explain it is that your shutter speed is opening every time and taking a picture for every one of those frames. So if you're taking 30 frames or 30 pictures essentially every second, then you can't possibly have a shutter speed of longer than 1/30th of a second. It's mathematically impossible to take an image that takes longer than 1/30th of a second to take and still take 30 of them in a second. So you're limited there in not being able to go any longer than the number of frames per second. On the other hand, if you go to a very, very fast shutter speed like 1/1000th of a second or even 1/500th of a second, what you're going to find is you're going to have a very staccato and sort of jumpy video, because every single frame, all that motion is going to be perfectly frozen and captured in time. The problem is with video, that doesn't really look natural. You want a small amount of motion blur that connects your frames and your videos together to make it very coherent and look natural. You don't want every single frame to be so frozen that it's kind of jumpy throughout your video. There's a rule for shutter speed in video called the 180-degree rule. And what it means is if you're shooting your frames per second at 30 frames per second, or whatever it is, that you want to go double the frames per second. So if you're shooting 30 frames per second, you would want to go with your shutter speed at approximately 1/60th of a second, or as close as possible. If you're shooting 24 frames per second, then you would want to go to as close to possible as your camera will allow you to 1/48th of a second shutter speed. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you would want to go double that to 1/120th of a second, or as close as possible that your camera will allow. My personal recommendation is to stick as close as you can to this rule. Now, there are times, depending on lighting situations, that I might try to change that a little bit to maybe allow a little bit more light in if I really need some more light. But for the most part, I stick as close to that rule as possible. The next setting I want to tell you about is ISO or ISO. ISO is the sensitivity of your camera's image sensor to light. In days gone by, you would be able to buy different sensitivities or different ISO of film, and you would put different film in your camera depending on what you're trying to accomplish. Today, we can do it on the fly and we can adjust it for every individual shot. A low ISO number like 100 is a very low sensitivity or low amount of light. But the benefit of having a low ISO number is that you're going to get a very good image. It's going to be the best image quality really that your camera is able to accomplish. If you have a high ISO number, and high is going to be sort of relative based upon the quality of camera and your particular model, but if you have a high ISO number like 1600, 4000, 8000, 12,000, that will let a lot more light, not let more light in, but make your camera sensor more sensitive to light, producing a brighter image. The downside is at some point in that range, again, depending on your camera, you're going to start to notice some graininess and a decrease in quality. Sometimes it's called digital noise. You'll see little specks sort of, but it will really depend on your camera how high you can go. Again, here's where I would recommend always shooting at the lowest possible ISO number that you can to get the best image. Unfortunately, if you're shooting in low light conditions, sometimes you don't have any choice but to raise that ISO to get the proper exposure. Even though you're going to lose some quality, if it's that last minute of daylight when that buck is stepping out, I'd rather have a high ISO and maybe a poor quality image, but capture them on video, than to have a low ISO and a clean image without any noise, but it's too dark. So sometimes there are compromises you need to make. The last setting that I want to mention about this exposure is the aperture. Aperture is basically a device inside your camera's lens that opens and closes to allow more or less light into the image. It's very similar to the pupil of our eye that opens and closes for more or less light. A low aperture number like 1.8 or 2.2 means that the aperture is very wide open, allowing a lot of light into the lens. A high aperture number like f18 or f22, that's a very closed down aperture that's going to allow a lot less light into the lens. An important thing to remember is that aperture also controls depth of field. Right now, imagine the camera is right here and the wall is back here. Depth of field is basically how much is in focus between the camera and the background. Whether it's a wall or whether it's off in the distance, but how much of the image is actually in focus. A shallow depth of field would look something like this. See how blurry the background is right now? That's a shallow depth of field. A large depth of field is when more of your image is in focus. A low aperture number like 1.8 not only lets in more light, but it's also how you accomplish that shallow depth of field, where that background is out of focus and the foreground or the subject of your image is in focus. A high number like f11, f18 is going to allow less light in, but is also going to allow more of your image to be in focus. Now this is a very simple explanation of this because there are some other factors that also control depth of field, like how far in on your lens you're zoomed, how close the subject is to the camera, how close the foreground and the background are to each other. These are some factors that are going to contribute to how much depth of field you're actually able to accomplish. Another thing to remember is that typically the kit lens that comes with your camera will have a higher minimum aperture number than a more expensive lens. For instance, this lens has a minimum aperture of 3.5. It's going to allow some light in and going to give you some depth of field, but not nearly as much as the more expensive lens I have on that camera, which is able to go down to 1.8 aperture, letting in much more light and a much more shallow depth of field. If you get a camera like this, you're going to want to check that out about what is the minimum aperture that's built in, because you're not going to be able to change out lenses, so you want to know what's the minimum aperture of your camera. I know some of you are going to ask, so what camera settings should I use? How should I set these settings for my hunts? I can't give you exact numbers, but I'll tell you what I do when I'm setting up for my hunt. The first thing I do is I try as much as possible to follow that 180-degree rule for my shutter speed. So that's fairly constant. As I mentioned earlier, depending on lighting conditions, I might adjust that to allow a little bit more light in, but typically I try to follow that rule. The next thing I do is I normally set my aperture to as low of a number as possible. The reason for this is I want as much light coming in as I possibly can, because what that will do is it will allow me to shoot a low ISO number, giving me good quality. And the last thing I do is I normally set my ISO to automatic. What that does is as the light changes throughout the evening hunt, let's just say, the ISO on the camera will automatically come up to adjust to what it needs to be for a proper exposure. Now, as I already mentioned, I want to shoot at the lowest possible number I can, but if I'm shooting at my 180-degree rule for my shutter speed, and I've got my aperture as low as I can to let in the most light, then really the only thing I have left to do is adjust the exposure using the ISO, and I'll just let the camera do that automatically to give me the proper exposure. This is just what I do. You may find something that works differently for you. I hope this conversation was helpful to you. If you have any questions, go ahead and leave them in the conversation down below, because I would be happy to help you in any way that I possibly can. Or go ahead and go find one of those YouTube channels that's all about video and photography, and continue to learn and increase your skills to make the best hunting videos you can. If you haven't already, I would really appreciate if you take a few moments to go and watch some of my hunting videos from this past year. I had a blast filming. I got some good hunts on film that I'm really proud of, and I even was able to harvest my biggest buck to date on video. If you've enjoyed this video and you haven't already subscribed, I would really appreciate it if you would take a moment to subscribe and even hit that bell notification button and continue watching the videos that I put out. Hey, until next time, I hope you remember to get off YouTube and get outdoors into God's great creation.